Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Joseph T. Cochran. We're going to talk about Jonathan Edwards. Maybe you could just get us started. I think people might know him as the author of one of the most famous sermons in American history, I think, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God.
That's right, Dr. Roach. Jonathan Edwards lived from 1703 to 1758. He was born to Timothy Edwards, a New England pastor. He followed in his father's as a successor and pastor in New England. He became the pastor of the First Congregational Church of Northampton, and subsequently ended up being one of the most prolific writers of theology and philosophy in the 18th century, besides being a renowned pastor and missionary.
Now, as a visiting professor in the history department at Purdue Northwest here, obviously we're not a theology school, right? So how do you talk about him in relation to American history?
Yeah, so typically I have a lecture in my general courses that is focused on the transatlantic awakenings of the Enlightenment period in the 18th century. And so I typically talk about figures like George Whitefield and John Wesley and Jonathan Edwards within that transatlantic movement that's a religious movement that is in some ways reacting to the rational, intellectual focus of the Enlightenment, but also appropriating a lot of the ideas of the Enlightenment at the same time.
Yeah, so we could say that Edwards was influenced by the Enlightenment, but was also somewhat a counterforce to the Enlightenment.
Absolutely. He spent a lot of time reading Isaac Newton, he spent time reading John Locke, and he spent times kind of figuring out how to appropriate those ideas, reposition them, even repair them for the purpose of defending spirituality, skepticism against religion, and really as a force to support the strength of Christianity in the Atlantic world.
And I understand he's sort of the American component of the Pietism movement, which starts in Europe, and he begins what we think of in America as the revivalist movement, perhaps, right? And the Great Awakening.
Yeah, he's considered to be the intellectual force of the evangelical awakening in America. George Whitefield crosses the Atlantic and begins preaching throughout New England. And really, he becomes like the first major common celebrity of the British Empire.
Interesting.
During his life, he would gather audiences of up to 20,000 or 30,000 people to just listen to one of his sermons.
So, I mean, we have ministers who are celebrities today, Billy Graham being one. But you're telling me that they had people of that stature in the 17th century?
Oh, absolutely. And this would be in the 18th century with George Whitefield. Yeah, in fact, if we're talking about 17th century pietists in Germany, the Halle School was developed, and one of its main leaders, August Hermann Francke, built the largest building in Europe at the time as a hospital and as a ragged school to be able to support humanitarian help in the urban area of Halle. So there were ministers doing all sorts of widely acknowledged popular activity for their culture.
And they represented a break from tradition in some ways, right?
I think so. Yeah, I think so in many ways.
So like they de-emphasized the rites and rituals of the traditional churches, for instance, right?
Well, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield follow the Puritan tradition in England, and the Puritan tradition removed most of the liturgy from the church. They didn't typically follow the Book of Common Prayer of the Church of England. They wore academic gowns when they preached sermons instead of wearing clerical vestments because they wanted to be considered experts of the Bible and as intellectual academics rather than being people who are leading through sacred rituals and rites.
And there's the Enlightenment influence right there.
That is definitely part of that Enlightenment influence that's there.
Yeah. And then some other aspects of this. They emphasized a personal relationship with God as opposed to, the theological traditions.
Yes, and so at the time when George Whitefield is starting to preach, one of the key ideas that he's preaching is the idea of this new birth that each individual can experience. And so there's a lot of like, I experienced this change in my life. I turned away from sin, as opposed to the communal expectation in traditional Catholic or even higher Protestant churches that have a baptismal age group, a communion age group, or a Eucharist age group, an age group that confirms together as a group, which is also part of that Enlightenment influence, is this individualism.
Yeah. And this, we call this a revivalist movement. What is meant by revivalist in this sense?
So there are a lot of elements that are really important to know about revivalism. One, there's literary production that's being produced. There's also mass promotion that's happening. When George Whitefield went to preach at a town, it was announced in newspapers. Benjamin Franklin was his major publicist for him. He would send advance men so that people knew that he was coming ahead of time, and it was promoted that he was going to be there to preach sermons. Jonathan Edwards published numerous sermons. He particularly got his publicity career up in front of the whole European world by publishing an account of the revival that took place in his town, Northampton, in 1734 and 1735. And he gave a very empirical reporting of the way in which people's lives changed and how widespread that change occurred. And it was published in London, it was translated into German, it was translated into Dutch, and hundreds and thousands of copies of that publication spread throughout Europe. It became one of the most popular writings of the early 18th century.
And we have revival events still going on today, right? So what would happen in Jonathan Edwards' time?
In Jonathan Edwards' time, you have various scenarios of what might have taken place.
Okay.
In the Presbyterian tradition, they actually had revival fairs that would take place particularly at what's called communion season. In the Roman Catholic Church and in other high Protestant churches, people celebrate what's called the Mass or the Eucharist every week. In traditions like Presbyterianism or Congregationalism, they would only celebrate what they call the Lord's Supper like twice a year. And so they would have a fair or a festival of religion that would take place, and they would build platforms, and they would have multiple preachers preaching at one time in the fields to thousands of people who were coming to be converted and to be able to experience the Lord's Supper for the first time. And so that's like one example of this kind of revivalism that took place.
But what about establishing that personal relationship with God? That's also part of this, right?
Yes, and so with that establishment of a personal relationship with God, there's this expectation that there would be like fruits in people's lives as a result. Instead of going to the tavern on Sunday or hiding in the stable with their friends, they would actually go into the meeting house and listen to the sermon. They would sing the songs that are sung in the church instead of the men quietly standing next to their families while the singing is taking place. They would spend time in Bible study early in the morning and in prayer in the early morning. And then they would engage themselves in what they called charity, humanitarian aid to the community, giving to the poor, giving alms to the poor, taking care of widows and orphans, fundraising for various community events that are taking place.
And this is called the First Great Awakening, right?
Yes.
There's a Second Great Awakening.
Absolutely. So,
how do we get from the first to the second here?
You know, that's a very interesting question. There are scholars who write that the First Great Awakening began in 1740 and it lasted all the way till the birth of our nation in the 1770s. Most people typically look at the First Awakening as a period that happened in the 1740s. After the birth of our nation, in the early republic, there is various signs that revivalism or renewal to religion is happening. There's horseback itinerant preachers in the Methodist Church that are traveling all the way through the frontier, performing baptisms and preaching sermons and helping start churches in the American frontier. At Yale, there's a renewal to a belief in the full inspiration of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that it's infallible, and a commitment to the fact that it's a reliable text. And there's a...
And Edwards, that's one of Edwards' concerns. He writes about the harmony between the two, right?
Yes. In the Second Great Awakening at Yale, it's his grandson, Timothy Dwight, who's the president of Yale and is leading the chapels at Yale and leading that renewal. And then the most famous Second Awakening preacher is known as Charles Finney. He creates an anxious bench. He preaches in a certain way that convicts people and makes them very anxious about like whether they believe in God or not. And he also makes belief in God almost transactional, like something that is an easy decision that they can make, where they can own the faith immediately and they can accept Christ and enter into the Christian religion in a very simple form.
Now, we have a term that people use today, being saved, right? How does that relate to that concept that we have now of being saved?
Yes. So when you get into the earlier 20th century or the late 19th century, you see more of this language that's being used. Groups like the Salvation Army populate this idea of being saved from your sin, and they use illustrations like there's this lifeboat, and you want to climb into the lifeboat, and you want to be saved by Jesus, and he's going to be the pilot of that lifeboat for you. A lot of that like language of being saved really comes from that era.
I see.
Yeah.
And as we're getting into the 20th century here, how does this relate to Billy Graham's Campus Crusade, which I think happened in the 1960s, was it?
Billy Graham really began his ministry in the 1940s.
Okay.
In the middle of the Second War. He starts working for Youth for Christ, and he is one of their major ambassadors that's promoting revivalism.
And he's pretty young at this point, too,
He's
I would assume.
He's very young at this point when this is happening, in the very end of World War II period. He had been a student at Wheaton College, he had been a student at Pensacola, and then his ministry is going to continue to grow and flourish. And he is going to have a great amount of influence through the various revivals that are going to be hosted. The most notable one happens in LA. Then there's another one that happens in New York, and also one at Madison Square Gardens. And these revivals are going to be promoted by the newspapers. There are going to be newsmen who are going to say, we want to puff attention to the tent revivals that Billy Graham is hosting.
Now, if he hosts a revival at Madison Square Garden, how many people are showing up here? This is a mass event, right?
Yeah, it's 40,000, 50,000 people, but it's also meeting every day for weeks. And so some people are returning,
I see.
But also new people are coming in and entering into them. And in the history of revivals that took place in the later 19th century and the early 20th century, this idea that you only have seats for like 5,000 and people are arriving and they're waiting and they're not able to get in and they have to go the next day, there is this critical mass of attraction that develops, especially as these revival meetings become protracted over the course of weeks. It gets a lot of publicity nationally.
Interesting. In Edwards' time, in our time, right, how have these movements affected history outside of the church?
It really kind of depends upon the era and what were the social concerns of the era. So when you get into the Second Awakening and you have a lot of women who are being oppressed in various ways in industry and in factories, or they're experiencing abuse, there is corollary movements that move with revival. The temperance movement.
Yeah.
The temperance movement becomes an offshoot of revivalism, where people who are devoting themselves to Christianity are at the same time also saying no to being underneath the slavery to alcohol in some sort of way. And that becomes a large reform movement in the United States that...
Well, alcohol is banned at some point.
The Volstead Act, and you end up having prohibition as a result of that. So that's like one instance that's taking place in the early 20th century. Another instance that's related to that revivalism is also women becoming ordained into ministry. And then those same women are the women who are also involved in women's rights for votes. And so they become activists in that area as well. And so you have these other wider resurgences that take place that are related to liberation for people. In Jonathan Edwards' day, one of the key influences of revivalism ends up being the opportunity of bringing the good news to natives and to indigenous people that live in that world. So when Jonathan Edwards gets fired from his church in 1748-49, he moves to the frontier and he's a missionary to the Stockbridge Indians for 8 years before he gets hired to be the president of the College of New Jersey, which is Princeton University today.
So if we move into the 1980s, you've got Carter running for re-election in 1980, and Reagan aligns himself with a lot of these Protestant networks and churches and things taking a stand on prayer in school and abortion. How do you see that in this context?
Yes, and so with Jimmy Carter, one of the most important aspects of his campaign was he let people know that not only was he a peanut farmer, but he was a Sunday school Baptist teacher, and he called himself a born-again evangelical. In 1976, Newsweek produces a cover issue called Born Again, the Evangelicals. Who are they? By the time you get to 1980 and you have Ronald Reagan's election, he's recognizing the popular influence of the evangelical vote. And so he's also going to lock arms with the evangelicals, and he's going to make sure that Billy Graham is somebody that he has conversations with. Billy Graham had conversations with every president from Dwight Eisenhower.
He was influential with Eisenhower putting "In God We Trust" on the currency, right?
That's absolutely correct.
Yes. So if let's go back to Edwards for a minute here in the Enlightenment. Is there an anti-intellectual element to this?
There is seen and perceived to be an anti-intellectual element that arises across the awakening. As the Methodist Church emerges in particular, there is a reaction against having to be educated at Oxford or at Cambridge. One of the patrons of Methodism is Selina Hastings, and she starts an alternate college called Trevecca College, meant to educate Methodist ministers. When you move into the later 18th century and you have a great vast frontier that's emerging in the United States, they're having trouble building churches to keep up with the towns that are being built, let alone having colleges to educate ministers. And so there ends up becoming this reactionary movement in the Second Awakening where people are no longer becoming educated and getting a college degree or receiving a college degree, and that being a requirement to be an ordained minister. They are just taking a Bible with them on their horseback, and they are just preaching what they read and see in the Bible. And it becomes even a skepticism of those who are among the educated elite.
Yeah, and that is what we would call anti-intellectualism, I think.
Yes.
So is there an element of that you see today?
I think that there is various streams within Christianity, and there is an anti-intellectual component. Sometimes that is because it's emphasizing an experiential experience as well. Oftentimes in society, when you see a wider anti-intellectual movement of censoring what people read, or being informed by the news. Religion is also going to be subsumed into that like wider movement that's taking place.
Yeah.
And in many ways, a lot of people can be socially controlled in anti-intellectual environments, especially if there's one authority who's considered to be the only intellectual in that space, like the religious leader.
Yeah. So as we look at the 20th century and the revivalist movements, how has media played a role in this?
Oh, so when radio comes into existence, religious leaders of all varieties are going to engage themselves in broadcasting radio. Father Cochran, who's a Catholic bishop, is going to have a widely syndicated radio broadcast. Amy Semple McPherson is going to be the first woman to both cross the nation in a car, leading revivals as she does it, and she's going to create a widely broadcasted, widely listened revival hour. Billy Graham is going to also host a revival hour himself, and other religious leaders. And one of the major contributions that Billy Graham is going to introduce is he's going to also have not just radio broadcasting, but television broadcasting as well. And the tele-evangelist market is also going to emerge in the 70s and in the 80s. And you're going to have various evangelical personalities that are going to host shows all day long on their own channels, doing variety shows, having conversations like this conversation, and then having preachers. And it's all going to be used to raise funds that supports the perpetuation of that television show.
Yeah. And what about social media?
Social media has become a massively influential, really since the dawn of Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. A lot of religious social events that have been like encapsulated in history by evangelical or religious leaders, but then also as they built their own platforms and started their own podcasts, they have become even widely more influential, and politicians have locked arms with these people.
Sure.
They've ended up on news in various ways.
Yeah.
They've gathered large cultural gatherings that support them. And oftentimes this ends up being tied up into politics as well, a certain kind of politics.
Yeah. So what are you working on next? What's your next book?
I'm currently writing a brand history of evangelicals that runs from the 1930s all the way to the present. When you move into that world of the growth of the ad agencies that are taking place and the creation of new consumer markets, I'm starting to look at the different evangelical organizations that come into existence, how they build a following, how they gather consumers for their products, whether they're creating literature or creating media. When you get into the 90s and 2000s, you have websites that are being created as avenues for both promotion and fundraising, but also to just gather religious interest. So I'm going to look at how evangelicals can be segmented, how they exist in affinity groups, how there are particular products that are sold to them, and even how you have significant events that become commercialized. When Columbine happens and you have this first mass shooting, there is a whole literature that comes up of martyrdom, of a young girl or two young girls who were killed at the Columbine shooting. And there are books that are written, there are songs that are written, there are t-shirts that are created that are meant to raise awareness of their Christian conviction even to their death.
Interesting. Now, do you think that they're aware of the fact that they're building a brand? Are they conscious of that, or is it just happening?
There is a definite consciousness that exists with the brand building and even the number of products that come into existence. And some of it is designed to support their ministry that they're engaged in. My first chapter of the book looks at a national phenomenon called See You at the Pole. And See You at the Pole becomes merchandised, where you have students buying T-shirts that they're going to engage in this one day of prayer at their school flagpole. There's little silicone wristbands that get sold that promotes it. You even can create tickets. So it becomes a ticketed event to go to this like free act of spirituality, at your school. And it becomes a largely commercialized.
We're all adapting to the environment, right? That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Joseph T. Cochran for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.